Honestly, a lot of podcasters, a lot of creators in general, they put on masks. People are craving relationships. They're craving honesty. They're craving candor.
Building trust in marketing, right? Which is the way to go. How podcast is allowing you to do this?
What better way to start and foster a trust-based relationship with somebody than record a candid conversation where you're genuinely curious about them, their accomplishments, their past.
I am Zach Carlin.
And I am Audrina Blackburn.
We are co-founders of Summit Chasers Network.
At Summit Chasers Network, we're all about being your go-to operations partner, the team behind the scenes helping you scale your business without losing your mind.
We're here to make sure your business runs smoothly and successfully.
They're seeing exactly who we are and they're either resonating and they're like, I love these guys, or they're like, not for me.
And for anybody who's listening that's been on podcasts, like think of how you feel when you're on the podcast where they come on, in and out, there's no conversation afterwards. What just happened? Well, I'm gonna move on with my day.
How do you make the mix of a good conversation that needs to be scripted by nature, but also to make sure that it's flowing and you have a good time?
So do your homework, find something to ask them, find some way to take the conversation that is maybe not something they've been asked a million times.
What were some of the biggest challenges that you encountered as podcasters?
Finding like, what is the purpose of your podcast? When you start a podcast, you have to be pretty clear, but then being okay if that purpose shifts, being willing to shift styles, being willing to shift how you run the podcasts itself.
I would add one other piece to that.
This is such a hard truth. Zach, Audrina, during our first conversation, I asked you if you knew Alex and Leila Hormozi, who are my idols, because they are a couple doing business together. And you guys are as well. So pumped to have you on the show. Tell me, how is it to run a business and a podcast with your significant other?
Ooh, who do you want to start? I'll start.
Go for it, Zach.
Well, we'll start with on the business side of things, running a business together as a couple. Obviously there's going to be some really good parts of it, really beneficial parts of it. And then there's some challenges that I don't think we foresaw when we first started out. And it's, where do you separate the two different types of relationships? Because it's two very different types of conversations, types of ways of communicating, different intensities. There's a lot that kind of goes into it that we had to learn really, really quickly. And actually our solution to it was fairly simple, but is to where to divide it. And to make sure that you're intentionally taking time to divide it and spend time with each other as a couple, not just in the business, because it's so easy to just talk business all the time, be in business mode all the time, always growth mode, visionary mindsets and all this kind of stuff, and miss out on the simple things, the simple stuff, like hanging out watching TV and not talking about silly things.
Right.
So one of our solutions to that was really simply like, for this conversation, I'm your business partner, so we need to talk to each other in a way that resonates for the betterment of our business and making decisions in that way and that type of stuff. And sometimes we'll have a tough conversation, a tough business conversation, and be like, okay, I'm talking to you as your significant other now. And then we soften it up a little bit. So sometimes it's just that simple, but it's been dividing the two different types of relationships and communication styles has been probably the most important aspect of it.
How easy or complicated is it though? Because you need to make a switch, right? You have a rough day at work, like business didn't come in or deal didn't go through, and like somebody did something, and like all of a sudden, oh honey, let's just switch and watch TV together. How does it work, Audrina?
Yeah, so honestly, I think that we've both been good at making that distinction and understanding like it's not a personal thing. If I have feedback for him in regards to the business or he has feedback for me in regards to the business, he's not like attacking me as a person. We're just trying to look at the greater good and understanding that we're on the same team as far as building and growing the business. And so I think because we have that understanding, it's been fairly straightforward to then switch and be like, okay, I love you. Like, we're in this. We've got this. Let's go have some fun and kind of get away from it. I think that helps a lot. I think one of the hurdles that we probably still face here and there is I think that we show up, probably me more so than Zach. I don't see as much of a difference in how he shows up in the working capacity versus life. But I definitely have a different energy that happens for me when I'm working, and it can lean a little bit more, I'd say, like into that masculine energy a bit. I was a VP for a long time, and so I'll have that creep in. And that's been something that I think has been a struggle for us, because in our relationship, that is not the case whatsoever. Like, I'm very much just kind of like sit in that feminine energy and let him lead and do all the things. But then when we're working together, I can come in a different energy than what he's used to. And so that will take some maneuvering and figuring out. But it's also been a good reflection point for me, because I don't want to necessarily show up into business like that. I think it's really important to have the balance between the feminine, masculine energy and all that stuff. So it's been understanding, how can I lean into that energy when I'm working too? And what can that do for the business to grow it and build it, rather than I was so used to having to show up in that masculine energy in my previous roles that it's been interesting to learn how to pull that back a bit.
Love that. So how do you manifest that with the podcast, Audrina? Because you both have had podcasts. I don't remember. Did you guys record some episodes together on the Summit Chaser Network podcast, or did you always have? Okay, so you did co-host some episodes as well. So how do you do that? Because there is the business side of things. There is the personal life, right? And to lean gently into podcast. Then all of a sudden you're speaking to the world, right? And anybody on earth literally can listen to that. So it's again another dynamic, right? How do you implement that as co-hosting a podcast?
I'll start with that one.
Go for it.
We're pretty lucky where we both, we can be a lot more ourselves with podcasting. That's the thing with podcasts, even the way marketing's going a lot right now, is so much of it is trust and relationship building focus now. I think it always had that aspect, but then some of these other tools, performance marketing, that kind of stuff, cold emailing, that it took a lot of that because it's easier. Where people are craving relationships, they're craving honesty, they're craving candor, they're craving throw an F-bomb in there every once in a while, sort of thing. So we've really leaned into that, and our personalities, like, there's a reason that we're together and we're able to go through some of the things that we've gone through, is because we have very similar kind of takes. We have a similar way of communicating. We can banter with each other and it be okay. Like, that's just like, we like to push each other's buttons, and we want to bring that to a lot of our podcasts, and we want to bring that to our podcast style. We want people to know us, not the mask that a lot of podcasters, a lot of content creators in general, a lot of them, they put on masks. We want to take the masks off, so that it makes it pretty easy. So even if you listen to our live shows that we do every other Saturday, the Summit Coffee Club, like, you'll see us, like, we'll start talking. I don't know if I'm allowed to swear in here, but we'll start talking shit to each other, and it's just the way it is. It's just like, we'll call each other out, and so it makes it really. And we don't take it personally. We don't. We know what it is. We both have thick skin. We know where we stand. We have a lot of trust, and that was the biggest thing, kind of developing that trust with each other, and learning each other's languages and that type of stuff. So I think it's because we're honest, and we are who we are on the podcast, and it just makes it really easy. So
also, on occasion, you'll hear us talking like about more personal things, where we will kind of like cross that line and talk more relationship type things that we're going through, or that's front and center for us. So we're not afraid to cross that line, I guess, while still being able to be valuable as hell in the space that we're in within our business too. So we kind of take the boundaries away. And I know you mentioned Alex and Layla at the beginning. They also, like, they don't have rules around when they do or don't talk about business. We definitely, I think, are a bit similar. Like, we could be out to dinner and we'll end up talking about work stuff because we're excited about it. We don't really put like harsh boundaries in place. And the same thing is carried through to our podcast, which, like Zach said, allows us to show up without that mask. Like, we're just being ourselves. We're talking about what excites us within our business, what we're working on with our clients, what's going on in our relationship. It's just kind of all out there.
Amen to that. So that's life goal, definitely. I noticed this with so it's a bit different. It's definitely not the same. But so we started a business together with my best friend, Hussam, who is the other co-host of this show. And we also noticed that at some point we were like, so 2 years into business, we have like conversation about business, and then we try to talk about other stuff because, that's what usually best friends do. And like the conversation dies out. And then we just, back into business because we don't want it to be a weird thing. It's just what we do. Love that. Zach, I want to come back on something you mentioned, which is building trust in marketing, right? Which is the way to go nowadays. And probably, across all channels, right? Can you tell me a bit more about how podcast is allowing you to do this with Summit Chasers?
What better way to start and foster a relationship with somebody, a trust-based relationship with somebody, than record a candid conversation with them where you're genuinely curious about them, their accomplishments, their past, Ours is more business, kind of life, business focused. We have some pretty intimate conversations with people, and you get to know them at a deeper level. You build that trust with them right away. It's easier to then networking. If you want to refer them to somebody or they want to refer somebody to you, you have a much better understanding of what a good fit and what a not good fit is going to be. And then when you want to follow up with them, it's so much easier because you know so much more about them. Hey, how are the kids doing? Hey, I hope your dog's feeling better. You just get to know them so much better. And then these conversations are so much more fluid. I remember the very first, on the Summit Chasers Network, one of the very first ever guests that I had on the podcast, and I went on his podcast as well. His name's Ron Nussbaum. He's in the construction space. He has a podcast, construction space. And that was over a year ago, well over a year ago. And we're working with him on developing his business right now. He's jumped in and done some of our programs to help develop his business and his strategic outlook on his business. And it's been one of the best relationships I've ever seen come out of just bringing somebody on and filming a candid conversation with them. I have dozens of other examples of just that. Like, there's no better way, really, or platform for it, really, than just having honest conversations with somebody.
I would add one other piece to that is we also go live on LinkedIn every single week for our Summit Coffee Club, which is essentially like a live podcast. Another great way to build trust. We're not editing stuff out. Like, we're literally just showing up and having conversations. They're happening real time. We might make a blunder. We might misspeak. We might say something that somebody doesn't completely agree with, but at least they're seeing exactly who we are and they're either resonating and they're like, I love these guys, or they're like, not for me. And that's totally fine too. And I think that that's the beauty in being able to show up in a public way, whether or not you're live or you're recording. The live obviously adds that element of like, we're literally not taking anything out. So what you see is exactly what you get throughout those episodes.
I love that. So, because that's the thing that you hit on, Zach, is the trust you build with the guest. But here, Audrina, you're on to the trust you build with the broader audience, right? Because if anybody can literally access this conversation, there is nothing hidden. Like, it's all out there. Is there any reason you would do more webinars than just podcasts? Because I'm asking this as that requires a bit more preparation as well, right? You need to come up with a title beforehand. You need to align on topics perfectly. I mean, if you want the webinar it's not really a webinar, but the live podcast to not have any dead times, or is it something that you would do intentionally, for instance? How do you manage that?
Zach preps all those.
Yeah, well, if you look at the funnel, like a customer acquisition funnel, like a podcast is like the very top. You're developing relationships with a very wide variety of individuals, and that's demographics, psychographics, industries, all these types of things. And some of them are going to like you just because they think you're funny and they like some of your content, right? They like the guest that was on there and they want something to listen to while they're on the treadmill, whatever it is. But then you're going to get that select few that are like, they ask the question, I want that, or how can I do that, or how would that work for me? And then the next step, it could be a webinar. It could be some sort of lead magnet. But I think webinars are great because you're right, they take more preparation and they take more time and all that kind of stuff. But it's also, okay, now here's proof. The things that I've referenced on my podcast, here's proof. Here's what I've done. Here's our content. Here's some sort of structure or framework that we've used to get XYZ result. It's a good next step in that frame. And then because they listen to your podcast, they trust you more. So now they're willing to spend a little bit more time. Because that's still a cost. Time is one of the most costly things we have. It's one of the most important, valuable things that we have, exchanges that we have. So to build that trust and them to then sit in on an hour-long webinar to get like proof, how does that going to work for me? Oh, I heard that story of this business, or I heard the story of where you came from and how you got here. I want to get a little piece of that. How can I do that? And the webinar can answer those questions in a structured, coherent way with an action to take at the end, with some sort of call to action at the end. So it's a very smooth transition. And again, you still get that face-to-face. You still get that trust. They can ask questions. They can see if you screw up a word or two. That's good. It means you're human. And we hide behind so much Flash and editing and all this kind of stuff, Photoshop and blah, 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 blah. So it's all these things. It's just another layer of trust that you're building.
Audrina, what do you think?
There's not a whole lot else that I would add to what Zach said. I think that he kind of covered the great side of having things that are a little bit more prepared. If you're referring to the live, Zach typically will put those together ahead of time. So we have like a loose framework that the conversation just goes. Because it's me, it's Zach, and then there's usually a few other people that will join us. we'll bring in guests and highlight their businesses and things like that. But it's a pretty open flowing conversation. Nothing is scripted as far as what we're talking about. It's just, these are some fun things that are going on this week, or he might turn something into a game to make it a little bit more exciting. But yeah, they're pretty open-ended.
That's the important thing too. I think some people hear this and like, we just get somebody on your podcast and have a conversation with them. What can separate you is like, what kind of spark are you're using to guide the conversation and to start the conversation in a certain way. So like one thing we'll do is we'll like make weird like trivia games. Like we've done a lot of like weird, like what are some examples? Like we had a lot of fun.
Some like
ones.
business trending, like what was trending in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s in business, or
Okay.
Good.
but what did they really mean? So we'll take like common vernacular that happens within the corporate world, like per my last email, or let me circle back, and we'll kind of like pick those apart and play games with them and say, well, what are they really saying when they send that? So we obviously bring in like a professional element to them. There's always a reason behind these games. One of my other favorites was he had a list of some real people, but then also fictional characters, and then saying what you would hire them for within your company. Like Deadpool was an example. And we're like, oh, we'd put him on customer support. And so we try to have a bit of fun and just kind of like
You would
pull the
kill it.
curtain back, loosen up a bit.
Man, I love that. I love that. That's a great idea. Deadpool as a customer service. I mean, you would torpedo the company right away, but I love this.
Yeah.
So, guys, tell me a bit more about the Summit Chasers Network podcast. So, why that podcast? Where did it start from?
It started out of, well, first of all, it started just out of, because I had a podcast at a previous agency, and we used that one solely for customer acquisition. Like that's really what it was. And everything was very scripted. I had 7 or 8 questions that no matter what I would ask, and it left very little room for candid conversations, to continue a conversation, to go down rabbit holes, to take things in a different trajectory. And I did a couple hundred episodes of that, and it just wasn't for me. It just didn't feel real. It felt fake. It didn't feel, it was harder to create relationships and nurture relationships afterwards, because people would get off and be like, I just did a job interview. Like it wasn't fun. So this one, I really wanted a way to connect with people in different industries and just create a network based on trust and a community based on trust. And if things went somewhere, they went somewhere. But really it was, and also I'm just very curious. So it was very self-serving, right? I got people on it that did cool things, and I just wanted to have conversations and ask them questions. So a lot of it was my own curiosity. And that's a good kind of place to start, I think, with some podcasters, is just what are you generally curious about? Because if you're curious about something, you're going to ask better questions. You're going to do more research. You're going to care about it more. So a lot of it was just my own curiosities, and then it kind of morphed into more of like still satiating my own curiosity, but developing our network. Like we take the network in Summit Chasers Network very seriously. So how can I create this network of people that I can connect with, and they can support each other? Like a lot of business owners, like the success rates, no secret what the success rates of businesses are, especially small to medium-sized businesses in North America. How can we create a community where we start to increase that number? We can start to support each other. So that's really where it kind of initially came from, and then kind of what the intentions blossomed into.
I'm curious to understand a bit more what made you think that you weren't building genuine connection with the more scripted podcast, right? How important is it to have a loose conversation or not with the guests, right? Because I'm asking this as you have some very successful podcasts which will always have the very same set of questions, or at least the same structure, right? And you're just going to consume those podcasts because that's exactly what you want to hear, and you know it's reassuring, you know what you're getting into. So what made that first podcast experience? I mean, you recorded 200 episodes. I mean, a couple of hundred of episodes, that's not nothing. So what made you think that the connections you were making through that podcast weren't as good nor significant as the ones that you did after, thanks to the Summit Chasers podcast? So
200 episodes is ish, probably 150 to 180 guests, right? And maybe had 10% of those be ongoing relationships in one capacity or the other, whether it's somebody who was a guest who came back as a returning guest, or we went on their podcast, or we met up at a networking event, or they made a referral or something like that. Maybe 10%, maybe. We would do 50 episodes, here. And for the Summit Chasers, whether it was Voices of Impact for hers or Summit Chasers, the Summit Chasers podcast or Summit Coffee Club, and let's say we did 50 episodes, most of them we either had on again, we would connect with afterwards just to see how they're doing. They would reach out to us. There was a very clear continuation of conversation one way or the other.
Interesting.
That was a big one. That they left that podcast thinking either I like these people, I like what they're doing, I want to learn more about what they're doing, or I want to support it in one way or the other. And you see a lot of these, because I've been on tons of podcasts myself, and there's a big difference how I feel too. And for anybody who's listening that's been on podcasts, like think of how you feel when you're on the podcast where they come on. It's very like, okay, these are chat GPT'd. Back when I had that other podcast, there was no chat GPT, but these questions are very chat GPT'd. It was in and out. There's no conversation afterwards. You sit there feeling like, what just happened? Well, I'm going to move on with my day, as opposed to like, I really like that person, man. That question really got me thinking about my business or my life or the way I lead or the way I think of marketing or the way I think of my product or my service, and that's positioned in the market or whatever it is. There's just nothing. You just kind of feel icky. That's a weird way to say it, as opposed to like
super transactional. It just feels very transactional, and you're almost like you can just tell that the host wasn't necessarily interested in like learning about you or who you are. They were trying to learn whether or not you needed them. And I think that is a huge differentiator in building real relationships versus like, are you just trying to put this person in your pipeline? Because that comes through so clearly. Like it's not hard to recognize that when you get brought onto a podcast and you realize, oh, they're just trying to vet me right now to see if I need to hire them. So,
or they just need a slot on their schedule, sort of thing.
Or like that, yeah.
I couldn't agree more. That's the philosophy of Podcast Gurus. I want to challenge it a tiny bit and get your thoughts on this. So the first podcast that we launched together with Usam, well, actually the second one, because the first one was a total failure, but the second one we ended up interviewing people with it, like high level, maybe not executives, but like high level decision makers within banks, within big corporations like CFOs. And the whole thing there was they actually wanted a scripted episode. Like we ended up a lot of times having guests who were like, no, but I want to see the questions in advance. I want to be able to prepare, which is fair, right? They have a whole PR dimension that we don't necessarily want to go into, but that we need to take into account if we want to have that type of guests on the show. So how would you recommend people listening to this show, for instance, who are faced with that type of guest, because that's by design, the way they go with the podcast? How do you make the mix of a good conversation that needs to be scripted by nature, but also to make sure that it's flowing and you have a good time and you have that amazing return afterwards, that where you connect with people and you actually build relationships beyond the podcast?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And there's a difference between, do you want to, like if you're to watch a show, like a TV show, a scripted TV show, do you want to watch the pilot over and over again, or is every episode different and it's catered to what happened last episode? And or the seasons of which the world is in right now. So you got to do your homework. That's the other, like you don't do the same questions, the same rhythm, the same timing every episode. Now, I've had a lot of them where they're like, I need to see the questions beforehand, or I need you to send questions to my PR person beforehand. That's fine. Do your homework. Ask questions. Like I had a great mentor on this, and he said one of the best ways you can get somebody who, like if you're here and you're interviewing somebody who's here, you want them to post, you want them to brag that they were on your podcast. You want to leave some sort of mark. So do your homework, find something to ask them, find some way to take the conversation that is maybe not something they've been asked a million times before. Do your homework, script out the questions for sure. It doesn't mean you script out everything you're going to say, but you script out the questions, good questions, do your homework, something that maybe, again, within reason, that maybe they haven't been asked before, or a place that maybe it might seem more, that's something that they're more passionate about, maybe, and then cater your questions to that and then send off the questions. But don't ask the same 8 questions every time in the same tone, in the same rhythm. it's just, I think that's a big piece of it.
Fair. I mean, one could argue that sometimes people like predictability, right? And that's why they will always watch the same kind of sitcom or whatever true crime series, because at the end of the day, you know the end of the episode. But no, I get you. On the podcast format, you want to actually bring that novelty on top of having a recurring theme of people you interview. Audrina, can you tell me a bit more about Voice of Impact? Like, what was this about and what was the philosophy there?
Sure. So Voices of Impact, I started it under the premise of wanting to speak to people who were making a huge impact, whether that be in their community, in the space that they worked in, just whatever it might be, influential people who are trying to make a difference. It then turned into me speaking only to nonprofit founders, learning about their cause, what their nonprofit was doing to try to address it. And then I found that, kind of going along what Zach and I were talking about earlier, I wasn't able to be myself. So I had that podcast for about 8 months. I recorded a good amount of episodes, was putting them out pretty much every week for the most part. And towards the end, I was like, things with our business are hugely picking up. The two are not aligned. Like we don't work with nonprofits. It was just something that I was interested in. I was curious about. I think that they're doing amazing work. I wanted to be able to uplift it. But I was also finding that I had to put on a mask almost every time. Yes, still a version of me, but I wasn't able to just like show up and speak freely. And so that became super taxing and tough to continue, especially with things picking up within our business too, and not wanting to blur the lines of like, do people think that we only work with nonprofits? Because it could not be further from what we have going on at Summit Chasers with working on business strategy for for-profit businesses. So it was just getting a little bit hairy, and I kind of had to take a step back and say, like, do I want to keep going all in on this? Or do I push pause, see if I can come back and explore the podcast space in a different way that will help promote the different businesses that we have? And that was the decision that I took. It was hard. It was a really hard decision to make. Also, like fear of judgment too, because if you lean so far into that space and then you come back and you're like, I'm not going to talk about nonprofits, that also just feels like kind of shitty. Like, I still think that what they're doing is so important. It doesn't align with everything else that we have going on. So I had to make that decision and put our business at the forefront and make sure that everything I'm doing is aligning with moving towards the goals that we have. So I'm coming back with a different podcast, and one where I can
alert.
Continue to be me. So that's super exciting.
Nice. And I think so that's super interesting. You're hitting on something that is something that we preach all day long. So first of all, disclaimer, I believe that we can totally have a podcast that has nothing to do with our day-to-day, and that is just as a hobby or a specific topic, which I guess you're pretty much aligned on this. But it's also very interesting, right, to have a podcast that is aligned with your business. But then my question is, to what purpose? So maybe, Zach, over to you. Like, how do you make the link between the podcast and the Summit Chasers network? Like, how do you link the two, and how do one benefit to the other and vice versa?
Well, it's just podcast. That's where people get entertainment and education, right? That's how they shop as well, right? They want to see who knows what. And we're talking to business owners right now. So that's our demographics. You have to decide who your demographic is how you're going to show up in your podcast. And to your point before, if your demographic is CFOs, finance, those people are very rigid, right? They like things that are predictable. So maybe a scripted type of podcast is right for you, and that's fine. I think for the most part, it's probably for most industries, it's maybe not, but there is going to be some where scripted and predictability is going to be the way to go. But for us, we're dealing with a very skeptical demographic. They're people who have tried things before, been burned before. They drink a pot of coffee a day. They got a lot of other stuff going on. If they choose to invest their time in a podcast, again, for them, time is very valuable for everybody, but for them, it's very valuable because it's scarce. So it's linking you have to trust us, you have to like us, like those two things, but then also we can get you the results. Like, we can help you. It's just them. We want them to listen to our podcast, to get entertained, have some fun, like us, but then also feel like I feel safe. I feel like this would be a good choice. I feel like his resources or the resources that are put in front of me are going to be some of the things that are going to help me move forward, are going to help me improve, are going to help my business grow, are going to help my life get better in some sort of way, help me prioritize my time, help me ask the right questions to both myself and the people in my business, people that work for me in my business. So it's again, it goes back to that linking, like the trust and the trust and the concepts, the knowledge, the frameworks, and that type of stuff, and kind of molding it all together to make them feel better. It's all about making them feel confident in a choice. That's really what a lot of like marketing is. We want them to feel comfortable in the choice to choose you over their other partners, their other options. Right. So that's a big thing with you want them to choose you over listening to other people, and then also to choose you. In our case, it is linked to the business to choose us over other options like coaches and agencies and that type of stuff. So
first of all, the pot of coffee a day definitely sounds familiar. Entrepreneur's life here. So on that point of the people being burned before, this is such a hard truth. Like, it's something that makes it harder for everybody else afterwards, because people tend to believe and trust less. I actually had, so I cannot name him because we are in the middle of the discussion to potentially help that person. But so talking to somebody, a coach who wants to launch a podcast, and he was explaining me how his existing ads agency was asking him to read scripts for the ads where he was point blank lying. Like, it would be, you need to say that people will get triple time the results, the turnover within 1 year if they attend to whatsoever. I was like, but actually people are pushing that. Not only are they lying in their communication to what the type of result can get to their clients, but are also making their clients point blank lie. And it's such a disease. It's so hard to fight. So how do you tactically then, Zach, and Audrina wants to have your take on this as well. How do you position the podcast content in a way that says, hey, you can trust me, I can help you? Because at the end of the day, you're just having a conversation as well, right? It's not like you're showcasing results within the episode. So how do you do that with a podcast?
So we do it pretty simply. One thing that we do a lot of is we do straight up case studies. So when we'll bring on a guest who has, let's say, an expertise in performance marketing, in Facebook ads, and whatever. And what we'll do is we'll do a little bit of research, and we'll put together some case studies. It could be case studies from like Apple years ago, or smaller companies, or case studies even from our clients. And we'll put the case studies up there, and then we'll talk through it. And then that's part of our content for the podcast. We'll talk through it. We'll debunk certain things like lying in ads, and why that is not the way to go. We'll try to debunk a lot of other kind of myths, or we'll call out practices like that are in the industry right now, or in many industries right now. And that's, again, it comes back to just real. There's not like this secret, like we're tricking people. It's just, let's just put it out there and talk about it, and then call it out. We won't call anybody out by name yet, but we will, because it's something that needs to be talked about. Because again, these are people that, like, they're so good at their own marketing. Obviously, they're marketing agencies, and they're so good at it. But then you get into the fulfillment part of their practice, and there's some very like, we've worked with a few performance marketing agencies. I've worked with many before as well. And the stuff that they're doing is like, as things get more, as algorithms get more complicated, as there's more competition, it becomes tougher and tougher to decipher between the legit and the, I'm going to make you lie in your ads.
100%. So tough. Audrina, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think in addition to what Zach said, I think just the nature of the type of conversation that you have. If you go the unscripted route, people are going to hear you showcasing your specialty on the fly. And that becomes very apparent. So if you're having these conversations and they're not completely scripted, maybe the guest says something to you and you're able to shine in your area of expertise, and people are literally just hearing you do this throughout the conversation. So I think that plays a huge role too. If you're listening and you're wanting to start a podcast, if you go that route of, yes, you can have like some core questions and some things that you want to focus on, but the less scripting you can put around what you're actually saying and how you're responding to your guests, it'll allow you to shine in your expertise in the moment, in real time. If you do anything live, another great opportunity. They're seeing your brain work. They're understanding how you approach problems within their business, and they're learning from you and with you at the same time.
That's gold. Actually, we never seen it like this. That's pretty good. Like the more natural and flowing the conversation is, the more directly tuned into the brain of the speaker you are. That's a very interesting point. I need to do more lives. So for you, Audrina, with the Voices of Impact, and you, Zach, with the Summit Chasers Network podcast, what were some of the biggest challenges that you encountered as podcasters?
I can start, Zach, if you want to think. For me, it was not being able to show up just as me. That is really difficult. So I think if you're going to, like I said, yes, it is me. Yes, I am curious about all these things. But the way that I had to, I wasn't comfortable. I couldn't really swear. Not that that's like something that's super important to do in podcasts, but I was also speaking to people who were very much talking about religion all of the time. And I was like, that's not the purpose of my podcast. So I was just finding that I was consistently having to have different types of conversations and getting away of like the core purpose of that. So I think if you're going to start a podcast, whether it's a hobby or whether it's aligned with your business, making sure that you can show up as authentically as yourself as possible is really, really important. And I think if you set yourself up in a way where you maybe need to just show up as a different version of yourself or a little bit more poised, and maybe that's not how you want to show up, that will become really hard to continue to feel excited about having the conversations. Getting guests, not a problem. It's pretty easy to do outreach. People are usually excited to talk about what they have going on and to present themselves. Learning how to be a conversationalist can be difficult if you don't feel comfortable talking with people, giving yourself somewhere to start from. I think that that's a skill that you can definitely flex and learn and grow, but that comes from something that Zach is really great at, being curious. If you're going to be a podcaster, you better be a very curious person. Otherwise, you're going to run into roadblocks along the way of like, how do I get more out of this person? Like they're kind of short in their answers. You have to make sure that you can keep the conversation moving. So that would be just a few things to think about.
That was really good. The only thing I would maybe add to that is, like, when we talked about like finding like what is the purpose of your podcast? Like if you start a podcast, you have to be pretty clear, at least initially, on what the purpose is, but then being okay if that purpose shifts. Because a lot of things are great. I mean, the old Mike Tyson adage, everyone has a plan till they get punched in the face. Is what it is, it happens.
It did.
Being willing to shift. Being willing to shift styles, being willing to shift how you run the podcasts itself. Like you might start really scripted and then think like, I'm not getting a lot of traction. I'm going to try to go a little bit more free flowing, or this type of audience, or sorry, this type of guest that I'm bringing on, they're not really hitting on what I was hoping I wanted, my audience to get out of it, and being willing to shift. That was one thing that was tough. Like I even said in my previous podcast and into this podcast, was the real purpose of it. And the purpose and kind of what got me excited about it, it shifted, and being willing to shift and not freaking out thinking you have to quit or you have to change everything all at once. But realize that, especially when you're a first year or 2 or 5 really of a podcast, like it's gonna evolve, it's gonna change, and being okay with that and trying things, getting feedback. But I think that was probably one of the biggest challenges, was initially not sticking to like that initial, like it has to be perfect, it has to run this way, I have to have this type of guest, it has to be this long, I have to post this many times a week, this kind of stuff. It's being malleable and being okay with being malleable. People have short memory span, like short-term memory. You put out a podcast and then 2 weeks later they forget the podcast even happened. So if you shift things a little bit, if you adjust the way you do your interviews, it's okay. But finding that is tough. It's tough to do, but you just got to stick with it.
I really like how both of you have. So, Audrina, you're around authenticity, right? It needs to be true to your own self, and you need to feel authentic and comfortable doing the podcast that you're hosting. And Zach is really on like, what's the purpose of your show? And it needs to evolve, or you need to evolve with it to make sure that, you're aligning both missions here. And that's a very interesting take and important indeed. Don't you think that somebody can be, and I have somebody in mind right now, that somebody can just be successful at podcasting without having that 100% alignment with the topic of their podcast?
For sure. I think that's the topic. No, not the topic, but that's the culture of it. It's the brand of it. Like if you look at some of the most successful podcasts out there, and you were to put, their top 10 episodes next to each other, and it's like, tell me what the topic is. Tell me what you wouldn't be able to be like, Like if you look at Joe Rogan, it'd be like aliens, politics, drugs, comedy, fighting. And it'd be like, whoa, whatever. But there's a culture, there's a brand around it. There's a brand around it for sure. There's a feel for it. There's, as the kids say these days, there's a vibe. And that's okay. And that's the way he runs. If you look at Diary of a CEO, the way he's structured, he's probably one of the best as far as planning and structuring his podcast that there is. It's just he puts so much time into it, so many resources, and he has a big team around his podcast. But even then, if you were to put his top 10 podcasts and you were to like pick a theme, it'd be like he's just very structured, very, he prepares, and it's very high end quality and that type of stuff. But if you're like, what's the theme? What's the topic? It's like, I don't know, talks about Elon Musk, talks about health, talks about Hollywood star, like it's all over the place. So I think like absolutely you can. If then that's the purpose. If you want a great podcast and that's just what you want to do, it's not necessarily attached to anything outside of it. It's probably the way to go. Like, what are you most passionate about? And it's probably not just one thing.
It can go in multiple directions. That's true. Guys, so one thing that I like a lot from Jeff Bezos is so when he was building Amazon, right, he was not trying to focus on, hey, what will be true in 10 years, like what will have changed in 10 years, but what will have not changed in 10 years, like the fact that customers want cheap, faster. Don't remember the third, so I would do a terrible CEO of Amazon. But so, same way, I'd like to ask you, since you've been in the place for a long time, what do you think will not have changed in 10 years in podcasting that people should double down on right now and like try and keep on optimizing around those? Audrina, starting with you maybe?
I think connection and stories. Like people get so inspired by other people's stories. It can be a motivation source for them. It can help them navigate through dark times, whatever it might be. So I think leaning into, here it is again, authentic connections and understanding and being able to share stories vulnerably is something that I think is never going to go away, and it'll continue. Like AI can't come in and replace that either. So think about
I was going to ask you that.
Experience.
Good
Yeah,
point.
the human experience and being vulnerable and showing all of the different sides of you in conversations is going to, like, we are so heavily going to have to lean into that human aspect and the human experience because that's something that AI will never have. So that's my quick 2 cents on it.
Love that.
I like it. And the only thing one thing maybe that I would add is that's not going to go away in 10 years is like the importance of like developing a community. Like if that's your goal to have a successful podcast or business, but we're talking about podcasts specifically, is that external community around the podcast. Like the podcast is kind of like, it's the fire that brings the tribe together, so to speak. But then like what keeps them in? How do you create the network effect that brings in more, that makes them want to bring in more, that makes them want to, they want to see more, they want more, they want to feel like they're part of the experience. And that, again, that could be something like a lot of like podcasters, or, they have like a Patreon as well, right? That has like behind the scenes looks or whatever it is. They have merch, they have communities, they put on events, and that type of stuff. Is the importance of community, I think that's definitely not going to change. And how do you create, like, think of how do I create a network effect around my podcast? And again, if it's a podcast with a business, then it's kind of all like one cohesive ecosystem. But how can I create like the network effect? That's going to be a big thing. It's been around forever. It got kind of less important like 5-10 years ago, but I think it's going to continue to be so important, is creating a network effect, creating a community, creating a brand. Again, creating that like that big fire that your tribe can kind of come around and be together in.
Connections and community, which are quite heavily linked together as well. Audrina, Zach, thank you so much for coming on Podcast Gurus. If people want to find out more about you or what you guys do, where should they go?
SummitChasersNetwork.com. You can find us on LinkedIn, Audrina Blackburn or Zach Carlin on LinkedIn. We've got some fun stuff coming up on there, so keep an eye out. That's where you can see our weekly lives as well.
Cool.
Our Summit Coffee Clubs every Saturday morning. Come hang out, chill with us, bring your coffee, unwind from the week, have some fun.
Love that. We'll put all the links in the description. Audrina, do you want to give a last word and spoiler alert to your upcoming projects, or should we keep it quiet for now?
I would love to say one thing, although I don't have a lot because we don't have a name. We are working on a name, but we have officially recorded our first episode for the new podcast.
Nice.
And all I can say is that I think female founders, but also moms just in general, will love it because we are getting very real, very raw about what does it mean to run a business, be involved with your family, have work-life balance? What are the struggles that we go through as entrepreneurs, and how do we keep moving through it? And we're not just going to say like, I once was here and I had minus $100 and now I have millions. It's like we want to sit in what was happening when we saw our bank account dwindling, and how did we actually find the motivation to continue to move through that? And then also talking about the experience of juggling all of the things all of the time. So my partner, Sydney, and I will be hosting that together. Very, very excited. Name is TBD. So you can catch that announcement on LinkedIn. I'm sure we'll be talking about it at our Summit Coffee Club and all of our socials.
Sounds exciting. As soon as we have the name and the link, we'll put it in the show notes.
Amazing.
Afterwards.
Thank you for
Audrina,
your
Zach,
time.
thank you so much for coming on Podcast Gurus.
Thank you.